When they blast these rocks, just at the ring of one alarm bell, everybody has to evacuate their homes so that blasting doesn't affect you. If you are met by the blasting, the house tremors, sometimes the buildings cave in and collapse. So whether you were cooking, whatever you were doing, you have to abandon it and run away until the blasting ends, you come back to your house. My name is Tijah Bolton-Akpan. I am the Executive Director of Policy Alert. Policy Alert is a non-governmental organization that operates across the Niger Delta. We have offices currently at Akwa Ibom, Uyo, Cross River, Calabar, and also in Abuja. We also moderate the Niger Delta Open Government Observatory, which is a walk-in and digital hub for promoting the uptake of open government reforms across the Niger Delta. Thank you. The Niger Delta is a peculiar terrain, like we all know, with its own peculiar geographies, its own peculiar social and political character. So working within this region throws up certain very unique challenges and also very interesting experiences. One of that has to do with the fact that this is a region that is rich in natural resources. And by that I'm referring to the oil and gas resources that come out of this region that is responsible for over 70% of budgetary revenue and more than 90% of export revenue of the country. So the Niger Delta is very important on Nigeria's socio-economic map, whichever way you look at it. And the fact that we're working in this terrain too throws up peculiar challenges, like I said. And one of those have to do with how the resources that leave this region measure up in terms of the value that comes back to the region, social development value, economic value, environmental value, and so on. Because it is very important to understand the relationship between what goes out and what comes in. When you take oil out of a particular environment and gas out of a particular environment, there are certain negative footprints that they leave behind. Those footprints are social, they are economic, and they are environmental. And I could just mention a few of them. So for instance, an oil company comes into a community, immediately the economic fabric of that community is changed. They buy from the same markets as the oil workers and so on, but they don't have the same purchasing power. So the dynamics change immediately. The same thing too with the ecological, context. So the environmental impact of extraction, leaves a lot of burdens on the livelihoods of these communities who hitherto depended so much on the natural environment to sustain themselves. But those natural environments like their farms, their waters, and so on can no longer produce as much as they used to. So these are all the issues. And then there is also the social factors, like the conflict that is exacerbated by the intersection between oil and gas extraction and intercommunal struggles for dominance over the spaces where that extraction takes place. So all these are some of the nuances that we have to deal with working in an environment like this. But then as we go on, we'll see how we've been able to overcome them. I wouldn't say so, for a number of reasons. So the international oil companies have been in bed with the Nigerian state to undermine the livelihoods and the rights, the human rights of the communities in this region. First off, the control of the resources are in the hands of the Nigerian state, and the IOCs like it that way. So the Nigerian constitution says upfront that any mineral resources under the ground belongs to who? The central government. That means that, the citizens of the region are upfront, excluded constitutionally, quote and unquote, from the management of their resources. And even other legislation, like, for instance, the Petroleum Industry Act that came, into force a few months ago, we had expectations that this act was going to, rejig, the framework, for managing some of these issues. But what we saw was like more of the same. The Petroleum Industry Act actually reinforces that injustice we see in the Constitution. So it starts off by repeating the same unfair provision that the resources under the ground, the mineral resources, oil and gas, actually, belong to the Nigerian state. So these are some of the issues. And then when you look at the way the operations of the IOCs, go on, you find that they do not measure up with the international standards. The way they operate elsewhere is not the way they operate locally here. And then the government regulatory agencies just turn a blind eye to some of these issues, whether you're talking about oil spills, whether you're talking about gas flaring, whether you're talking about the rights, land rights of the communities. So you just see a lot of encroachment on community spaces, their land, their farms, their homes, and so on. So many communities have been displaced in the region as a result of oil and gas extraction. And for that reason, I would say that their operations have not been fair to the people of this region. Well, when you talk about representatives, you should be looking at it at multiple levels. So we have representation at the community level, and we also have representation at a political, a more formal political level. So for instance, communities have their own communal modes of organizing. You have village councils, you have community development associations, you have youth associations, women's associations, and all that. These are leaders in their own right. But you also have more formal political organizing. So for instance, you have the legislators who represent, these constituencies, right? Whether it is at the local government level, at the House of Assembly level, or at the National Assembly level. These are all representatives. Now, your question is, could these representatives actually be to blame rather than government? These representatives actually constitute the government. So they play a role. We have different arms of government: the executive, the legislature, the judiciary, right? The representatives of the communities sit in the legislature to create laws, like the PIA I talked about. We had representatives from this region sitting at the National Assembly and deciding on what happens to the oil and gas communities. An entire chapter of that act is devoted to host community management. But we saw that the provisions were actually counter to the interests of the citizens that they represent. So yes, you are right on that score, that their representatives in government are partly to blame. But are they completely to blame? No. We also have another level of blame to look at. That is the blame of the government itself, and by that I mean the executive. So the executive actually fashions out the day-to-day utilization of resources in the interests of different constituencies. The job of the legislature is just to approve, these policies. Now, what we see is that one of the most important policies that government actually needs to approve has actually been converted into an annual ritual. And by that, I mean the budget. So whether it's at the national level, at the state level, or the local level, you need to, you need to aggregate your ideas for developing the community into a budget, into a fiscal plan of how the resources are going to come in and how they are going to be utilized, right? So that particular plan has been turned into child's play. In most cases, what we see is that the role of citizens in ensuring that the budget actually represents their own priorities, has not been centered in the budget making process. And that actually, distorts the entire essence, of budgeting, which we are going to talk about. I'm happy you chose two companies that whose operations actually cut across different natural resources. So oil, gas, and mining. So Exxon Mobil, for instance, has a lot of operations across oil and gas, and while Lafarge Africa has a lot on mining. Good. Lafarge Africa in this part of the country operates in Cross River State. They have a limestone operation at a community known as Mfamusing in outskirts of Calabar in Akampa local government area. Now, what has Lafarge Africa done? First off, we find that the mining lease that this company had several years ago from the federal government of Nigeria covered an area of 50 kilometers square. Now, that area intersects with forest reserves, areas that government had on its own set aside for conservation of forest. And you remember that the Cross River rainforest is actually one of the last remaining tropical rainforests in the world. And it is diminishing at a very alarming rate. So for government to even, give a mining license to a company, and delineate the area of the license to cover a forest reserve like that, it's like government making a law and actually flouting the law by itself. Now, coming to the role of the company itself. The company itself, since it started operations there, has not followed its own, standards, its own stated standards. So if you go to its annual reports, its sustainability reports, which it publishes every year, you find that they make bold about so many standards and so many, principles that they follow in their operations. But when you go to the ground, just last Saturday we were there, and you heard tales of woes, like you put it, from the community members. When they blast these rocks, just at the ring of one alarm bell, everybody has to evacuate their homes so that blasting doesn't affect you. If you are met by the blasting, the house tremors, sometimes the buildings cave in and collapse. So whether you were cooking, whatever you were doing, you have to abandon it and run away until the blasting ends, you come back to your house. These are gross human rights violations. Talk about the cancerous effects of the chemicals that they use in their operations, the minerals that they spew into the air and all that. The air they breathe is polluted, it's poisonous. The land on which they farm is poisonous. If you go there, you look at the plants, even the vegetables they plant, it's covered by cement dust, right? The waters have been poisoned. They can't even drink the water from their own community streams. They have to go to nearby communities to buy pure water, which they use for drinking. So this tells you a whole lot about, the role of corporations, in communities in the Niger Delta. So, and then do these companies actually engage with the communities? That's another ball game altogether. There is something known as free, prior, and informed consent. So before a company gets in to operate in a certain area, they have to engage with the communities first off and get the approval of the community to enter. That's FPIC, the free, prior, and informed consent. But in most cases, whether it is in mining, whether it is in oil and gas, you don't get to see communities giving their consent before companies come in. What you see is that people just wake up and see companies in their communities. In fact, the companies might have been operating there for several months, sometimes even years before the community becomes aware that there is a certain company like this operating in their backyard. Now, this has very unsalutary effects, on community livelihoods, on environmental standards, and so on, because you do not know who exactly to hold accountable. Right now, you talked about Exxon Mobil. Exxon is selling off to Seplat. The transaction is happening, and we put out a notice the other day and said that for that transaction to be approved by government should insist that the company does the right thing. That Exxon Mobil, for instance, cleans up the mess it has created, because Seplat is an indigenous company. Now, Exxon Mobil has operations in different parts of the world, and they are used to being held by higher standards elsewhere. But you're talking about leaving your operations, divesting, and moving your operations into the hands of a company that's not used to high standards, right? Even the Exxon Mobil we are talking about has operated by very, very low standards compared to the standards it operates abroad. So by the time you move that to an indigenous company, you're further lowering the standards. And that's something we do not want to see, given the peculiar plight of the communities in this region. Whether you're talking about gas flaring, you need to go to these communities. I'm sure you have in the course of your work. See the kinds of skin cancers, the kind of respiratory diseases, the kinds of other kinds of even reproductive disease problems that people are having in these communities as a result of the poisoned air, poisoned land, and poisoned waters, which is a fallout of these operations. So my thinking about this and the thinking of Policy Alert as an organization is that the role of these companies, whether you're talking about Exxon Mobil, whether you're talking about Lafarge Africa, whichever of these companies you're talking about, their role in the degradation of the Niger Delta environment has been, copiously, documented. So what should be done now is that the government regulatory agencies should step up to the plate with regard to their responsibilities on holding these companies accountable. There's so much legacy damages that have been done, and we're hoping that governments can actually hold them to clean up the mess before they move on, because we're entering a whole new chapter of their operations, especially given the energy transition and the fast pace of divestment away from fossil fuel to cleaner and renewable energies. I think that a significant part of the blame would go to government. Government has a huge responsibility, a constitutional responsibility to protect its citizens and provide for its citizens. Now, providing for its citizens, you could rationalize that to say that, okay, government is extracting these resources, converting them into budgetary revenues that could be used to provide social services, right? But are the communities actually seeing those services? That is, a huge gap that currently exists. The other point is that government has regulatory responsibilities. It is government's role to hold these corporates, corporates accountable. Government isn't doing that nearly enough right now. And that is why we are insisting that the government regulatory agencies, whether you're talking about the successor agencies under the PIA, that's the National Upstream Petroleum Regulatory Commission, the Nigeria Midstream and Downstream Petroleum Regulatory Agency, the agencies in charge of oil spills like NOSDRA, the NESRA, the Environmental Agency, and so on. These are all agencies that have huge environmental regulatory responsibilities. But currently, they are not actually living up to the billing as far as these responsibilities are concerned. Okay, so I'd like to give a backdrop to that. So before now, budget documents were not routinely disclosed. Those of us who are in the business of policy advocacy, especially around budgets, used to find it very difficult to access, public budgets, whether it's at the federal, the states, or the local levels. But things have changed. We now have a situation where budgets are routinely disclosed. In fact, at the national level, just at the tap of a click of a mouse, you can get all the fiscal documents you want to get about Nigeria's budget, whether it's the budget document itself, the call circulars, the budget implementation reports, and what have you, the audit reports, and so on. At the state level, we also have an increasing number of states, publishing their budget documents, which is quite impressive. I mean, in the past few years, we have got to a point where more than, at a rough guess, I would say more than 90% of the states in the country are currently publishing their budgets, which is very impressive. So we've got to a point where budget disclosure, proactive disclosure of fiscal documents has become routine in Nigeria, especially at the state level. Now, within that context, it becomes really odd for a particular state not, to publish their budget. And that is why the case of Rivers State is pretty disturbing. So Rivers State, among the 9 states of the Niger Delta, is the only state that has not published its 2022 budget and has not published its 2021 full year budget implementation report. And the question we're asking is, could this be because Rivers State has too much money? And as such, for instance, some of the incentive programs that has actually encouraged some of the other states to publish their budgets. For instance, the state fiscal transparency, accountability, and sustainability program for results. That's a World Bank Ministry of Finance program that's providing some funding to states in exchange for them meeting some deliverables in terms of fiscal openness. Now, Rivers State, we've had stories making the rounds in the media that Rivers State is uninterested in this program. Could that be because the state has so much coming in as 13% derivation from its oil production and is making so much from internally generated revenue? Rivers State has a lot, of IGR, a huge IGR base. So could it be that inflow is creating some kind of a conceited, attitude within government that is making government closed to reform initiatives? I think that reforms should not just be about incentives. Reforms should be because it is the right thing to do. When you open budget documents, what happens is that you are also creating, strengthening the intra-government accountability processes. So within government, there is a lot of accountability, mutual accountability between agencies going on. For instance, every state has something called the Office of the Auditor General of the state. That office actually relies on the budget and those fiscal documents published by the executive to track what the executive is doing. So not publishing the budget actually frustrates the work of government. The same way too, it frustrates the oversight function of the legislature, which is also supposed to monitor and track what the executive is doing. So not publishing these things there, actually limits how much these other arms of government and these other MDAs who have accountability mandates are able to do. Then it also frustrates the role of citizens as accountability actors. So citizens are supposed to participate, in the budget process. They are supposed to look at the budget to say, okay, this actually answers to my priorities, but this one does not. So by the time you're coming back to me next time, I will say, no, take this out, but include this because this is what my community really needs. Now, citizens are not able to do that if the budget is not out there in the open. So it actually frustrates the role of citizens in the budget process. It also fosters corruption. When the budget process is opaque, when the management of public finances is secretive, what that does is that it enables, politically exposed persons and other elements within government corridors to actually use public resources for their own pockets. And nobody is able to see where those public resources are going, and that way corruption becomes, commonplace. And because of these issues, we have continued to harp on the need for budgets to be open. Nigeria signed on to the Open Government Partnership in 2016, and within that framework, Nigeria has a responsibility to report to its peers on how well it's opening up its budget processes, besides a whole number of other commitments. Now, there is also a subnational level to the OGP. So state governments, currently over 20 state governments have signed up to the OGP. I think at the last count, there were close to 26 state governments that have done that. Now, this is telling you that state governments are rapidly embracing transparency and accountability. They want to be held accountable. When you do that, when you open up your systems, what you end up doing is that you are building trust of citizens in your government. All over the world right now, the trust deficit is one of the biggest political problems in the world right now. Citizens, different surveys, researches have found that citizens have a very low level of trust in their governments. And this is not peculiar to the developing world. Whether it's in the West, you're looking at it, or here in Africa, the results are the same. What is responsible for this low level of trust in political, officials? One of those is that systems are not really open by default. So for us to build trust in government, one of the things that need to be done is to open up fiscal governance, public finance systems. That is very important. And that is why we are pushing for the Rivers State government, to open its budget. Rivers State is, funny enough, it is one of those states whose governors has been at the forefront of asking the center to do the right thing. So we cannot have this kind of contradiction in terms where the governor is demanding fiscal justice from the government at the center, whereas back here, the government is not stepping up to the plate. It's not actually delivering fiscal justice to the citizens. The beginning of fiscal justice would be opening up the budget process in the state, and I think that's very important. Well, if you ask me now, who I go ask? So I think you are right there. Access to information is actually critical. It's critical for enabling citizens' voice and agency. And it comes to the very heart of what democracy means. So democracy, we talk about government of the people, for the people, and by the people. The by part is fundamental. Citizens have to be seen as being a part and parcel of the governance process. The fact that you've elected certain people to represent you does not mean that you have foreclosed your own self-representation. You have a voice as a citizen. And that comes to the whole idea of the social contract. So there is a social contract that the citizen enters into with the government or the political actors at the ballot, right? Now, that is what the citizen gives. On the other hand, the government official or institution gives back, social services, gives back protection, gives back public services and so on to the citizens. So you need to constantly measure the flow, the back and forth flow. What citizens are actually giving to government? Are they getting a commensurate, payback in return in terms of social services, in terms of security of lives and property, in terms of prosperity, opportunities to grow, as citizens in the country. So coming back to Rivers State, I would say that Rivers State actually has a huge opportunity, given the resources at its disposal, to help move a huge number of its citizens out of poverty. Unfortunately, we still have a very high unemployment index in the state. Rivers State, among the 9 states of the Niger Delta region in 2020, was the least performing on the Subnational Budget Transparency Index. Rivers State is one of the few states in the region that has not signed on to the Open Government Partnership. Rivers State is the only state in the region that has not published its 2022 approved budget and its 2021 full-year budget implementation plan. So Rivers State has recently become synonymous with opacity of in governance of its public finance management. And I think that it shouldn't just be a few NGOs doing this. It has to be a citizens-led movement. The demand pressure needs to come from the side of the citizens to ensure that the government does the right thing. And the place to begin is actually publishing its budgets and its other fiscal documents, because that is actually what citizens will use to track its performance. Give it to the government. There's a whole lot we are seeing in terms of quote-unquote infrastructure. The flyovers, so Mr. Project here, Mr. Project there. But how do you actually track Mr. Project to ensure that there is value for money in these projects? That is a huge question that is left unanswered. How can citizens actually say, when he was presenting the 2022 budget, I can quote him, he said that he's going to do everything in his power to ensure that this budget achieves over 80% performance budget implementation. Now you are using data, you are using numbers, you're giving people, the citizens, numbers that they're going to judge you by, but you're not giving them a related evidence by which they can track those numbers. So the budget is not there, the budget implementation reports are not there. So how will the citizens know whether you have done 30% or 80%? So these are the issues. So we are insisting, we are calling on the Rivers State government to, put forward out there online. We are in the digital age. At the click of a button, you should access any documents you need. I think Rivers State owes its citizens a huge responsibility to do this. The government does not have any right to withhold fiscal documents from citizens. Citizens have a right to know. And there are a lot of interesting legal frameworks that actually empower citizens to know. So Nigeria has the Freedom of Information Act, which was enacted in 2011, which empowers any citizen to demand for these documents. So we need to see a flurry of requests, by citizens, by community groups, by media actors like yourself, demanding for some of these documents, as of right. You send a Freedom of Information request to any government agency and say, I want to see how much you spent on this project. I want to know how much was in the budget for this project, what was actually released and what was actually used. I also like to see the procurement information, which company actually handled this job, how it was advertised, how competitively the company was selected, what was the bill of quantities and so on, what were the terms, of the contracts, and did the final job actually meet those specifications. Once citizens are able to do this more routinely, we're going to have a system where, there is more, not just transparency, but also accountability.